Okay, so the book of Esther. So the book of Esther, well, it's one of only two books in the Old Testament that has a woman as its main character. Obviously, the other one is Ruth. Esther herself is a Jew. The context of the story is set within Persia, and Esther is a Jew who rises to prominence by marrying the Persian king. And Esther is then involved in thwarting a plot by one of the king's chief administrators called Haman. He plots to exterminate, if you like, to commit genocide against the Jews, wipe out the Jews from among his people. And Esther, through her position of prominence within the Persian court as the wife of the king, she's able to thwart this plot. So in chapter 1 we read that the Persian king has a wife called Vashti, and Vashti disobeys the king. She defies the king and won't do as he says. So he decides to divorce her because he doesn't want this to be set as a precedent for wives disobeying their husbands throughout his kingdom. So he decides to divorce Vashti and choose another queen.
So in Esther, when his wife won't appear before him, just when he calls for her, the king is furious about this and says, what am I going to do about this? If I don't punish her, if I don't do something about it, then wives everywhere will not bother doing what their husbands tell them. So this kind of winds me up a bit, that this seems very, very striking, but it doesn't really seem to be the central concern of the book. It's not what the biblical author's mainly concerned about. But the biblical author's concern seems to be with the Jewish identity of Esther, with her relation to her people.
Now, as part of the process of choosing another queen, he orders for all the finest, most beautiful young virgins in the land to be brought into his harem. And it seems that they have to be compelled maybe to come so that he can pick the best one to be his wife. Now, as part of this process, it says that while in the harem, these women, these young virgins, spend a little time kind of beautifying themselves, getting ready for the king, and then one by one they go into the king night by night, and he chooses his favourite, and eventually he does choose Esther.
If you get outraged by all the things that ancient authors don't get bothered about that you do, then you'd spend a lot of your time being outraged if you read ancient texts. So I'd be outraged if someone took this as a model for how they should run a kingdom, or how they should run a family, or how a marriage should be run. But it would seem to me a waste of energy to be outraged that this is the way the biblical author thought.
So the turn came for each girl to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women. Since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfume and cosmetics for women. So they spend all this time getting ready to go into the king night by night, and he chooses his favourite, which eventually turns out to be Esther. We've mentioned Song of Songs before as possibly not mentioning the name of God. Well, Esther certainly doesn't mention the name of God. There's no real reference to, and no explicit reference to God, no reference to the Jewish traditions, the things we'd expect to see, law, covenant, whatever like that. So it's really a narrative that, in some respects, you've got to say, why is this in the Hebrew Bible? Why isn't this in the Christian Bible? What significance does it have if it's not talking about God? Is it talking about God? And the answer is yes, it probably is. That's why it's made it into the canon of Scripture. And one argument is that this is the story refers to the providence of God. So the actions that take place are all under God's control, even if God isn't explicitly mentioned. Well, in the Greek version, so in the Septuagint version of Esther, this is actually longer than the Hebrew version. And this is quite different in a way, because here we've got lots of explicit mentions of God, or explicit references to God. So, for example, Mordecai and Esther, who are the chief figures in the book that we have in our Protestant canon, in the Septuagint, in the Greek Bible, they pray to God. So what you'll find is that in the Protestant Bible, these additions to Esther, as they're called, are included in the Apocrypha, so in the part which in some Protestant Bibles comes between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, for example, in my Apocrypha, in this version here, we've got Mordecai's prayer. So, edition C, this is called, Mordecai prayed to the Lord, calling to remembrance all the works of the Lord. He said, O Lord, you rule as king over all things, for the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel," and so on. So clearly referring to God there, which is quite different.
Like a director's cut of...
A director's cut. Well, in a way, it does. The Greek version being longer and with these references perhaps helps with the interpretation of the Hebrew version. It does actually is an interpretation in itself, because it's making reference to God in places where it might even be implicit in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so one of the problems that some people have with Esther as a book of scripture is that, first of all, Esther has to do things like hide her Jewishness, maybe break food laws and other things like that in order to rise to prominence. So the question is this justified in order to save the Jewish people? Is it justified what she has to go through first? But there are other problems, like it seems that Mordecai and Esther become quite vindictive towards the end of the book. So when they've thwarted Haman's plot to wipe out the Jewish people, in turn they then kill those who are plotting against them. And although they don't kill as many as the king allows them to, they don't kill the wives and the children, I think, still there's 100+ people put to death. So these are some of the problems that arise in reading the book of Esther as scripture. So another reason that some scholars suggest that the book of Esther is in scripture is as a sort of justification for the Jewish festival of Purim. So Purim is a festival where the Jews celebrate their deliverance from this plot to wipe them out. So the book of Esther itself provides, if you like, a basis for celebrating this, which is still celebrated today, this festival.